Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. It is with immense pleasure that I welcome you all to the 6th edition of the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference. In a time where dialogue, discussion, and tolerance for opposing point of views seems to have diminished from our country's social fabric, the LSE Pakistan Development Society continues to provide an avenue for leaders to deliberate on Pakistan's most pressing affairs. The Society functions with a genuine hope of stimulating constructive discourse among Pakistani students abroad and has long served as a symbol of resilience in the face of immense uncertainty back home. We deeply appreciate your time today, but hope you recognize that your presence at this conference signals something profound. It signals that Pakistan is also in the hands of a generation that cares. The Future of Pakistan Conference is the Pakistan Development Society's flagship event. This year's conference will explore the theme A New Frontier, Reconciliation, or Polarization. In today's volatile political landscape, Pakistan stands at a critical crossroad. Throughout the course of the last year, dominant and extensive upheavals in the political structure of the country have inflamed Pakistan's long-standing cleavages. Today's conference aims to explore the political, economic, and constitutional underpinnings of the country's contemporary challenges. ख़वातीन व हज़रात, ज़रूरी है कि हम इस बात को अच्छी तरह ज़हननशी कर लें कि हम आज यहाँ पाकिस्तान की तरक्की और इस्तेहकाम के लिए जमा हुए हैं। हर पाकिस्तानी की ज़िंदगी का मकसद होना चाहिए कि हम पाकिस्तान को खुशहाली की राह पर गामज़न देखें। फ्यूचर ऑफ पाकिस्तान कॉन्फ्रेंस एक अहम मौका है जिधर हम बेहतरीन तरीके से अपनी आज़ादी राय का इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं और मैं उम्मीद रखती हूँ कि इस कॉन्फ्रेंस के अख्तिताम पर हम आज यहाँ इकट्ठे होने का मकसद हमेशा अपने दिलों में याद रखेंगे। The Pakistani Development Society hopes that you leave today's venue with answers, but more so with the desire to raise questions about the systems at play around you. May we never take our freedom of speech for granted and always use it to further the cause of our great nation. We will now inaugurate today's conference with the national anthem of Pakistan to serve as a reminder of what it is that we are trying to achieve today. Please rise for the national anthem. I would now like to call upon Hasib Altaf, our events officer, to come and read out some important instructions for the conference. Yes.
Thank you, Meerub. I would like to take the opportunity to make a series of important announcements regarding rules and regulations that will remain in effect throughout the duration of today's conference. First and foremost, please note that you are not allowed to take any photos, videos, or audio recordings during the session. Any attempt to do so may potentially open you up to legal liability. Next, no sharp objects, nationalistic and political symbols, such as flags and banners, are allowed to be displayed inside the venue. If these items are found to be in your possession, they will be confiscated. Additionally, no food or liquids are allowed inside the venue as well. Furthermore, you are expected to maintain discipline and order while the guests are speaking. After the moderated discussion, the floor will be opened for a question and answer session. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and someone from the host team will come to you with a microphone. Please keep in mind that your questions must be appropriate and precise, and that the speaker reserves the right to not answer if they deem the premise unfit. The academic chair for today's proceedings is Dr. Nilanjan Sarkar, Deputy Director of the LSE South Asia Center. I would now like to invite Ahmed Zeerak Rana, Co-President of the LSESU Pakistan Development Society, to come on stage and formally introduce and initiate our first session entitled Civil-Military Relations, Coexistence, or Confrontation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So, there is no doubt that the citizens of Pakistan have had their fair share of struggle and a really complicated dynamic with the military junta of Pakistan. At times, we have welcomed coups when we have seen economic instability at the hands of the civilian leaders, but we have also protested against those same military leaders if they've stayed on for longer times. But at the end of the day, the idea of a hybrid regime is conjecture and is open to interpretation. However, in his farewell address, the outgoing Chief of Army Staff, General Qamar Javed Bajwa, categorically stated, and I quote, "Despite the fact that the armed forces are day in and day out involved in the service of the nation, they are still heavily criticized by the public." General Bajwa added that in his opinion, it may be because the military has been interfering directly or indirectly in the country's political affairs, which he thinks is unconstitutional. That is why he said, "We, after much consideration, in the February of 2022, came to a conclusion that we will not intervene in any political matter. We are firm in this that we are sticking to this doctrine and shall remain so." At this juncture, we have to discuss what is the credibility to his words. Are the armed forces of this country in reality neutral? If they are we ready for it? And if they aren't, is it necessarily a bad thing? To discuss this, we have our esteemed list of speakers. Joining us will be Lieutenant General Muhammad Haroon Aslam, a former 3-star general of the Pakistan Army and its former Chief of Logistics Staff. Holding a master's degree in defense studies and political science, Lieutenant General Haroon Aslam served in the Pakistani military from 1975 to 2013. His career began in the Azad Kashmir Regiment, and he later commanded the Bahawalpur Corps, before successfully leading the Pakistan Army Operation Rahe-Rast and Operation Black Thunderstorm against the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Following his retirement, he served as the Managing Director for Fauji Fertilizer between 2014 and 2017. He currently serves as the President of the Iqbal Institute of Policy Studies and has also recently initiated his own YouTube channel by the name of Veteran Speaks, where he comments on geopolitical and domestic challenges faced by the country. We are honored to host you and hope that we can have an insider's perspective from General Haroon Aslam. Our second speaker is Mr. Michael Kugelman. He is the director of the South Asia Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. His expertise in South Asia affairs are wide-ranging, having covered Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan affairs. Mr. Kugelman is the author of the Foreign Policy magazine's weekly South Asia Brief and authors the magazine's monthly South Asia column. Alongside foreign policy, he also frequently contributes to the New York Times, Politico, and Bloomberg, and has been featured for comment on CNN, BBC, and Voice of America. Mr. Kugelman's expertise in Pakistan has also been translated into longer publications such as Pakistan's Interminable Energy Crisis, Is There Any Way Out, and Pakistan's Runaway Urbanization, What Can Be Done. And he has also edited or co-edited 11 books. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, Mr. Kugelman holds an MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts University and a BA from the American University School of International Service. Our discussion will be moderated by Dr. Farzana Shaikh, an Associate Fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also called Chatham House, and provides regular analysis on current political and economic conditions in Pakistan. Dr. Shaikh has held a number of academic teaching positions in the UK, Europe, and the United States, and has been appointed to senior research fellowships at the University of Cambridge and the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton and Paris. Until 2021, she served as a trustee of the Charles Wallace Educational Trust on Pakistan. Dr. Shaikh has written widely on Pakistan's domestic and foreign policies and is the author of most recently of Making Sense of Pakistan. Her new book, out next year, explores the use of Sufism as the soft power in Pakistan. Dr. Shaikh has testified before the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee and the Commons All-Party Parliamentary Committee on Kashmir and was invited to give evidence to the International Development Committee of the UK Parliament for its inquiry on UK aid to Pakistan, published in April 2022. Dr. Farzana Shaikh holds a PhD from Columbia University in New York. I'll now hand over the conversation to Dr. Farzana Shaikh.
Does this work or shall it's on, right? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you also to the organizers of the Future of Pakistan conference. It's a great privilege to be here, not for the first time, I might say, but for the third time. And each time it has been an immense privilege for me to be here, both as a speaker and as a moderator. Now, what I want to do today, we've had those introductions, so I'm not going to take time introducing my panelists, both extremely distinguished in their own right, once again. What I want to do is just to provide some kind of context and background to this panel before I then put questions to my panelists. There will not be any formal presentations as such. The aim is to have a conversation, a free-flowing conversation going. And so what I will do is, kick off with some questions, one, possibly two, and put them to my panelists. I will sometimes select one over the other, depending on their specialism, but of course that doesn't prevent the other panelist from stepping in to give his opinion. So that's the way the proceedings, I hope, will go. I want also to have maximum audience participation, and so I have set aside about 30 minutes for Q&A. Now, it's just coming up to, it's just gone midday, and with any luck, we should get through this part of the proceedings in the next 50 minutes or so, and then leave the rest of the time for questions and answers. So, let me, as I said, give a little bit of background to why we're here, what we're talking about. So I think it's plain to see that Pakistan has been in a state of acute turmoil since a vote of no confidence brought down the government of former Prime Minister Imran Khan in April of 2022. Now, one might argue that this is nothing new. Pakistan, after all, is no stranger to crises. But I think what makes this moment stand out is a confluence of crises: political instability, economic turbulence, and escalating terrorism, to say nothing of the devastating floods last year. And together they appear to have driven the country to the brink of national chaos. Now, some have gone as far as to say that the present crisis could be, quote, the worst threat to Pakistan's national cohesion since 1971, when it lost its eastern wing following a bloody civil war. Others insist, however, that such fears of state fragmentation are exaggerated. Now, be that as it may, there is, I think, a broad consensus that much of the country's current predicament is rooted in the corrosive effects of the long-standing imbalance in civil-military relations. They stand as never before exposed by the breakdown in relations between former Prime Minister Imran Khan and Pakistan's all-powerful military establishment, precipitated by Khan's allegations that the military establishment under its former chief, General Bajwa, had conspired with the United States to orchestrate his downfall. They led to a dramatic reversal in hitherto cordial relations between the two sides. Now, many have struggled to make sense of these developments. Their confusion has been compounded by widespread perceptions that the military had long favored, if not facilitated, Khan's rise to power. Khan himself did much to encourage such speculation. He was quoted on more than one occasion as declaring that he was, quote, on the same page as the military, and often took pride in contrasting this position with what he called, quote, a checkered relationship of previous governments with the military. In addition, this seemingly functional relationship between Khan and the military leadership spawned the idea that Pakistan had entered something of a grey zone, neither a military dictatorship nor an elected government with control over the levers of power, but a sphere defined by what has since come to be known as a hybrid regime. Now, if so, it has clearly proved to be short-lived, and it will be the task of my panelists, I hope, to enlighten us on where we go from here, to a new beginning or back to a familiar stalemate. So, what I want to do is to start off with a very general question, which I'm going to put to both panelists. And I want to start off with a brief reference to the history of Pakistan's civil-military relations and consider if this is the time to bury the threat of the so-called doctrine of necessity. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the doctrine of necessity, it refers to a legal precept which seeks to render, quote, that which is otherwise not lawful to be made lawful by necessity. Now, it was originally a medieval doctrine, but it gained its most potent and modern expression in Pakistan in 1954, when it was invoked by Chief Justice Munir of the Supreme Court to validate the extra-constitutional dismissal of an elected prime minister and the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly by the Governor-General. Munir then used it to legitimize the military takeover by General Ayub in 1958, after citing the takeover as the introduction of a new legal order. Since then, the doctrine has been repeatedly invoked to justify military coups and takeovers in Pakistan, leading in some cases to the suspension of the constitution, as under General Zia, or its blatant disregard as under General Musharraf. I mean, who can forget General Musharraf's reference to the Constitution of Pakistan as, quote, just a piece of paper that he could throw in the dustbin? Now, while I understand that neither of my panelists is a legal expert, I thought it would be instructive to start our discussion today by getting their thoughts on whether they think a military takeover in Pakistan is ever justified, and whether its persistent threat may have corroded the very foundations of the stable polity needed to produce a more balanced relationship between civil and military authorities. So, General Aslam, do you want to kick off and give us your thoughts on that first very general question?
Thank you very much. I hope you can listen. I'm audible. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. I would like to thank LSE and the Pakistan Society, Development Society, for inviting me on a very sensitive subject. I face such questions on daily basis, being a general, and but let me tell you that I do not represent GHQ here. I do not represent Army. I retired 10 years back, and I have my opinion, and I try to give it very candidly, and to my juniors also who are in power and in chair now. Well, the law of necessity, as Dr. Sahaba said, it was not invented by Pakistan, but it was specialized in Pakistan in the form of military interventions, starting from 1958. Pakistan became a security state. Well, it is the reality. I'm not going to deny it. But now, the importance of the military in our society, in our day-to-day functioning, is there. But having said that, the military has never asked deputy commissioners not to do their job. Military has never asked the revenue people to do corruption and stave off the money towards different direction. So therefore, military has never been an impediment to the governance. So what happens is, when we say that military has taken over, it is not the military, the sectors of military, army, navy, air force, paramilitary. It's the top leadership. Top leadership, starting from Ayub Khan, Yahya Khan, General Ziaul Haq, and then General Pervez Musharraf. They take the decisions, and then the army, being a disciplined force, it follows. So you can't question a junior officer posted on the line of control. You cannot criticize those soldiers who are giving their lives. So therefore, what my request is that when you talk of military interventions, those should be in the proper context that this is the top leadership of the military. And my friend there talked about the last retiring Chief of Army Staff, and he quoted that henceforth we will not intervene. And when he was mentioning this, he was himself not serious, and so was the guy to him this statement is attributed. So therefore, my concluding remark here to your question is, the answer is that yes, law of necessity must be buried. But what does Pakistan need? Pakistan needs political stability. And sitting here at LSE talking, I cannot tell you, I am a very small person to tell you, unqualified person, that if Pakistan has to progress, there has to be political stability. Economies flourish on the bedrock of political stability. We have to have smooth transition of power from one government to the other, which we don't see. That's my question.
Thank you. Thank you. What I thought was going to be an extremely ambiguous answer turned out in the end to be, I think, fairly categorical, I would say. So I am assuming that you believe under no circumstances is it justifiable for the military to seize power.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with that. Michael, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you as well for having me. It's an honor to be here at this conference. I mean, the good news, it's been quite a long time since there was a coup in Pakistan. There's never been a longer period of civilian rule than there is now, even though one could argue that civilian rule has been heavily dominated by military influence, especially in recent years. Of course, I don't think there should ever be another case where the military seizes power in Pakistan. If Pakistan wants democracy, if it wants to be a democracy, it should do away with this threat of this doctrine of necessity. It's an inherent rejection of constitutional principles, and so long as it looms, it threatens to undermine the very real democratization successes that Pakistan has quietly seen in recent years, such as the 18th Amendment, which I think is something that we often forget about. Of course, there have been efforts to try to do away with the 18th Amendment in recent years, but I think it's important that we not forget about some of these modest democratization success stories that go beyond this long period of civilian rule. But so long as undemocratic forces continue to hold such sway in Pakistan, and here I refer to the military, I doubt that the threat of this doctrine of necessity will go away. I think it's also difficult to expunge this threat, so long as the argument can be made, as it is sometimes, even if indirectly, that civilian institutions and leaders are weak, ineffective, that civilian leaders are corrupt, ineffective. I think that those that might support this idea of a potential greater power harbored by the army, the military, the argument is perhaps made because of this idea that maybe the civilians can't be trusted, which I certainly don't agree with, and I think this is something important to discuss. It's a very important issue, but I leave that as a final caveat. I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm sure there will be time later on during the Q&A to explore a little bit this question of whether or not labels of division and corruption should be attached purely to the political classes, right, and civilians, and whether or not it could, of course, be applied more generally to include the military and other state institutions. On that point, I just want to pause for a minute and say that some of you will have noticed that there is no civilian voice from Pakistan here, and as chair and moderator, I cannot be expected to play that role. But what I will try and do is to insert subtly, if possible, in my questioning, a civilian perspective. It's regrettable that we were not able to get a civilian voice here this afternoon. The second question that I wanted to put to my panelists is the role of the military more generally in politics, and to assess this role in terms of whether or not the military is a benign or a malign force. Now, this may seem to some of you to be an odd question, to some of you raised in the United Kingdom, raised elsewhere in Europe or in the United States. But I think it is fair to say, at the risk of provoking some outrage, that in Pakistan, the jury is still out on the relative merits of the military in politics. I mean, it is common, for example, in Pakistan, to point to long periods of stability and economic growth tied to military regimes. Many look back with nostalgia to the 1960s, when General Ayub's military regime promised to set Pakistan on the path to join that elite club of Southeast Asian economic tigers. And while the repression of General Zia's military dictatorship remains an indelible mark, black mark, against military rule, the Musharraf era appeared, to some at least, to have restored the standing of the military as a benign force by releasing, for example, the shackles placed on the media. But extended periods of military rule in Pakistan are also seen to have exercised a malign influence by systematically undermining the political classes, by treating them with derision and casting their efforts to consolidate democratic government as self-interested. And so what I want to do is to ask my panelists, and I'm going to go here to Michael, how would you, Michael, assess the record of the military as a force whose role has been largely positive or deeply damaging to the future course of Pakistan?
Right. So I think that one could argue, and maybe this is an obvious point, that the role of the military in politics has been undemocratic in the sense that there's nothing democratic about unelected forces exerting their will over elected forces. It's a very basic point. But of course, from much of Pakistan's history, from much of Pakistan's history, the country has not been a democracy. But for me, one thing that's very troubling and concerning, and this has been a reality for so long, is the role that the military plays in policy and politics, such that you see dissent and critics suffer so much. I think it's very clear. I'm perfectly happy to make that argument, and there's been a lot of attention to what's happening in Pakistan right now. But this is an old story, that critics, those that dissent, journalists, have suffered significantly over Pakistan's history, and I think it's quite clear that one has to look at the establishment, so to speak, and the intelligence agencies that have played a role in that. And that's simply, obviously on grounds of democracy and moral grounds, that could not be, in my view, that could not be defended. But, I think that this question of benign or malign, for me, and I won't dwell on this too long because I think you'll want to describe this later. For me, where one could make a particular argument that the military's role has been malign is in the economy, separate from politics. Yes, you talked about how one can perhaps credit this period of some economic stabilization and liberalization when Musharraf was in power, but let's not forget about the history that the military has played in its hogging of budgets, and also the economic empire that the military has and has long had. It's never been held to scrutiny. It's never been held accountable for that. Consider that against the backdrop of a country that has suffered for so long from economic distress, and we know what's going on right now. But I think that, for me, is where I would be very comfortable using the word malign. When it comes to politics and policy, I see that as undemocratic. I would certainly consider that as malign as well, but I think one has to look at the economic context, where you certainly start to see the really unfortunate aspects of this very large, overpowering military role.
General Aslam, would you want to add to that?
Right. I, oppose this concept that you lump it entirely on the army. It is a collective thing. May it be politicians, may it be intellectuals, may it be bureaucracy. They all join hands with the military dictator. So therefore, if you single out and bracket them into being a malign force, add the other people also. Why I say this? Because let me go back in 1993 when there was a political deadlock between the President of Pakistan and the Prime Minister. There was complete deadlock, and that was General Wahid who actually unlocked, and then we moved on to the elections. So there is a streak of positivity also. I've said earlier that I do not support military takeovers. But what the dictators do is, the military rulers, that they try, the moment they take over, within a year, they try to be politicians. They put a semblance and facade of a civilian rule, and then all the category I said, all the politicians and intellectuals, journalists, every civil society, they join them. So therefore, it is a collective failure when we talk that it is a malign force. Michael mentioned about the defense budget. There are gross misunderstanding about the defense budget. Yes. Now, if we are talking that as if the military eats up the defense budget without any rhyme or reason, and that is the money they just stab off and take home, that is wrong. Then you have to see what is going around Pakistan today. Just see the map of Pakistan. You have Iran, which is a perpetual underdog of the world, and then you have Afghanistan, where there is no peace, China emerging, and USA trying to control, and then your India, which is a perpetual enemy. So there you have to defend yourself. And then you are the people who actually biologize and clap when we shoot down and get hold of Abhinandan. You have to have military force. So therefore, I say categorically, yes, when it comes to military takeover, it is the malign force. But otherwise, armed forces, the military is for Pakistan and stands for the security of Pakistan.
Right. Well, I mean, my contribution to that bit of the discussion would be that, as we know, Pakistan has experienced 3 decades or 30 years of direct military rule, not all in succession, admittedly, and at least another decade of government under military tutelage in the 1990s, to which reference has been made, with 4 years most recently under a hybrid regime. Now, that, by my calculation, puts the military at the helm of power for almost 45 years of Pakistan's 75 years as an independent state. So I'm just wondering, I mean, would it be reasonable to assume then that responsibility for the multiple crises that are now coming to a head in Pakistan must, in the end, lie largely with those who have controlled the levers of power for more than half of Pakistan's history? Or should we turn to their causes, as General Aslam has indicated, to Pakistan's fractious political classes who are blamed for prioritizing the elimination of their political rivals over and above the interests of the country? Michael, you want to pick up on that, and I'll just get
Sure.
to General Aslam?
No, I think looking at the current poly crisis, as you put it, I think that both the civilians and the military deserve blame for where we are. Looking at, and I think the economic crisis is really the question of the moment, and there's going to be a great session on that later. But you look at where we got to where we are. I think that you're looking at an economy that had been vulnerable for many years because of structural problems, and then when you had these external shocks posed by the war in Ukraine and COVID, that caused this huge explosion. But I think you could identify successive governments, political leaders, civilian leaders in Pakistan engaging in policies that simply made the economy worse and worse, and that ranges from depending on textile exports and not sort of adjusting to changes in the world and trying to develop more of a diversified export economy. It includes things like maintaining a focus on an agricultural sector, which has continued to employ so many people but has not been productive and efficient. Now, those I think we could place blame on the civilians for that, for sure. But I think if you look at the security, if you look at the resurgence of terrorism, well, I think here this gets into very different issues. I think this gets into the Frankenstein's monster effect, which I would describe. That for many years, the military and the army had sponsored, supported violent actors, militant groups. Some of them ended up morphing in ways that they turned against the state. And so I think that this long-term policy of sponsoring certain militant groups, of appeasing certain militant groups, of favoring talks, negotiations, peace talks, whatever you want to call it, with the TTP, that's one reason why things have gotten to where they are, for sure. I would argue that Imran Khan, he was very closely associated with this idea of talks with the TTP. He's a civilian, obviously. So I think that you could place the blame in many directions. Certainly, we don't have to get into the whole regime change allegations, though maybe that'll come up anyway. One can certainly fault the former army chief for his role in the events leading to the current crisis. One can fault the current government, the PDM, for playing retributive games against Imran Khan. One can fault Imran Khan for his own political games and stunts that he's carried out over the last few months at such a critical, difficult time for the country. So, yeah, it's a good question, but a complicated one. And I think that no one is blameless in this regard.
General Aslam?
Yes, surely I'll go along what Michael said, that you cannot squarely put the blame on the meddling army. When we are talking about the poly crisis, which is social, which is economic, which is of stability, which is of, in every sector which we see, if you go by the perception indices, we are the lowest in the region. So therefore, it is a collective failure of state and the society. And one thing I would just like to add here, that the outgoing director of World Bank made a comment that about the elite of Pakistan, about the elite capture. What he said was that here is the elite of Pakistan, which has most of the money. They are wealthy, but they earn in Pakistan, but they like to spend in Dubai. They like to shop in London. They would like to have destination weddings abroad. They would like to own property in Dubai and elsewhere. So whether do they need Pakistan or not? You see, since the subject is civil-military relations, so where do I put that elite? In the civilian or in the military? So therefore, it is a collective failure. And we talk about the top echelons, but what is going on with the poor people of Pakistan, the lower courts, the police stations, the lower bureaucracy, the provincial bureaucracy? Actually, it is a moribund forces which are operating in this realm, and the governance is really gone to dogs. So therefore, I would, to answering the question is that it is a collective failure, again mentioning those words, the state and the society. They together make what Pakistan is.
Well, that brings us very nicely to my next question, which is really trying to consider the ideal balance of a civil-military relationship. I mean, there has been much talk in recent months of the urgency of putting in place a neutral military that stands above the fray of politics and that refrains from acts of political engineering with which it has been commonly associated. Now, given what we've been hearing these past few minutes, I mean, is this still within reach, given the long history of the military's intervention in politics, and indeed the still bitter controversy over its role in favoring or not the government of former Prime Minister Imran Khan, or have, as again has been intimated, or have the many compromises, both historical and in recent times, of Pakistan's political classes with the military undermined the prospects of a stable relationship emerging anytime soon? And just before I open that up to my panelists, I am reminded here of a recent column by a contributor to Pakistan's national daily, Dawn, who observed a few days ago that, quote, "It is still the case that the road to Islamabad can only be traveled by those who enjoy popular support as well as the approval of the establishment. One without the other doesn't get the party anywhere as yet." Do you want to comment? General Aslam, why don't you kick off on this one?
Yes, we are talking about the neutrality. Yes, the ideal is that military, and I am a former soldier, and when I say this to you, I say to my own department also, the own institution, that we have to go by the will of the people. This is the lesson of the modern world. But then, when we are talking about the military intervention or not being the neutral, it is that the civilian component, the politicians, the bureaucracy, they themselves give importance. The relationship between the civil and military is a triangle. It is based on hate, love, and expediency. They love army. If anything good happening on the border, we have a score against India, everybody starts loving military. And then when there is something negative like intervention and all, people hate army. I see it daily. But then there is expediency. Expediency is there are journalists, there are politicians, there are bureaucrats, they would like to what they call it gate number 4. I hope you know that the gate number 4 of the GHQ, and try to maintain good relations. So it is not that military itself is proactive in trying to, not being neutral, but it is again a collective kind of thing. I voted for Imran Khan, and I'm going to vote for him again. I write in his favor. You see my vlogs and all. But didn't he give extension to General Bajwa? Why? And he regrets this now. Then if you are maintaining a barometer of neutrality, then you have to be neutral yourself also. Be neutral to the Constitution of Pakistan. General Mr. Asif Ali Zardari, he gave extension to General Kiani. So why? They should not have. I feel, and this is my contention, I believe that the military should stay neutral and do not meddle into politics. But remember, you cannot switch it off. You have to give a leadership to Pakistan like Erdogan of Turkey. And I tell you, you have good leadership at the top level, at the medium level, and in futuristically you are grooming good leaders to go up. Then the military will itself recoil to the barracks.
A reiteration, then, of many compromises of Pakistan's political classes. Michael?
So the military is not going to be neutral anytime soon, if for the foreseeable future. I did not vote for Imran Khan, but I'm going to talk about Imran Khan just for a second to try to answer your question. Khan, of course, he had his falling out with the army. He lost power. He developed this strong anti-military rhetoric for quite some time. But look at what he's doing over the last few months. He's quieted that anti-military rhetoric. He has not been speaking publicly against the military. He's also been toning down his rhetoric against the U.S. He's been trying to distance himself from the U.S. conspiracy allegations. Why is he doing this? Well, my sense is that he wants to return to power. And he knows that if he wants to return to power, his chances, he puts himself in a better position if he's not upsetting the army as much. And I think that's a reflection of this fact that, yes, all roads to Islamabad, I think, still lead through Rawalpindi. And that gets to a broader question that, if we want to talk about the possibility of a neutral army or a neutral military in Pakistan, only if the politicians decide that the military is no longer necessary to work with, only if the civilians, if the politicians conclude that they don't really care about their relations with the army, only then can you think more about a neutral military. But the point is, the military is so powerful and remains so that I think that, unfortunately, politicians have no choice but to follow that path of, at the very least, trying not to antagonize the army as they work toward achieving the highest level of political power. And beyond that, there's clearly going to continue to be a desire to ensure that relations are good with the military. Now, I would maybe disagree a bit with what General Aslam said before about the military and perceptions of it in Pakistan. I would argue that we've seen in recent months the military has been on the defensive in ways that it has not been for quite some time. And maybe going back to the period right after the bin Laden raid, when General Kiani was taking a lot of flack, both from the public and also within the army. But I think this is even more serious, what it's going through now. We've seen what Khan was able to do with this narrative that he put out there that was against the army, and his support base jumped at that, to the point that the army, I think, is that's had an impact on public perceptions of the military. Obviously, I speak as a U.S. analyst, as an outside observer. I don't want to speak for the Pakistani public. People should correct me, but I think that's a very important point. And I mentioned this earlier. I spoke at the Karachi Literature Festival just a few weeks ago, and I was struck in the sessions. The speakers and also the audience were openly and just very sharply critical, specifically of the Army and the ISI in ways that I didn't remember happening for quite some time. And this is a public, prominent, on-the-record forum. So I think that's another. And finally, it's important to remember this gets to the issue of civilian capacity once again. There's ways that the military in Pakistan can be very effective in ways that entail it being neutral. You look at how whenever there's a terrible natural disaster or where there's an emergency like the floods, it's always the army that's leading the response, right? There's nothing wrong with that. That's good. The problem is that there's been significant issues with the capacity of civilian institutions that are meant to be undertaking these emergency responses. That's sort of a separate matter, I think. Going back to what I had said before, but I think that's sort of a broader way of looking at this question of the military and its neutrality. I think that the army has to, and it's a good thing that it's out there leading these flood response efforts, for example, just because that's the best way to bring relief at a moment when there's concerns about the capacity of civilian institutions.
Thank you, Michael. So some convergence there in views, but also some differences, particularly over the issue of the military now being on the back foot, as it were. So I want to digress just for a moment here and consider very briefly how you think other state institutions, notably the judiciary, the executive, and the office of the president, have contributed to the distortion in civil-military relations. It seems to me that the military establishment, political parties, the judiciary, the election commission, and the office of the president are all locked at the moment in a power struggle, a perfect clash of institutions, one might say. The latest episode, as many of you will no doubt be aware, centers on the question of who or which institution was constitutionally empowered to announce the date of elections. In early February, the president set a date for provincial elections in Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, fueling claims that he was exceeding the powers of his ceremonial role and taking a partisan stance that favored former Prime Minister Imran Khan. This week, the Supreme Court ruled rather controversially that the president was constitutionally empowered to set the date of the election under certain circumstances. Observers, meanwhile, take the view that elections held now would almost certainly result in a resounding victory for Imran Khan and his PTI, but that it could also intensify political instability and deepen political polarization. More importantly, it is feared that given the near collapse in relations between Khan and the military establishment, Khan's return to power would not be met with equanimity by the military leadership. Now, what might this spell for the future of a more balanced civil-military relationship? Michael, you want to pick up here, and then I'll come to, or perhaps General Aslam, you want to pick up on this one first?
May I revert back to the last question about the relationship or the image of military in the public? Michael has attended one of the functions and he feels, yes, the tempers are high, there is criticism of military, and because of obvious reason, I myself do criticize the people in power that you've done something wrong. We meet informally, that was a wrong decision. You must see, what I'm saying is that it fluctuates. It's not perpetually there. Why? The structure of the military. What is the structure?
Can we just address this question about the role of other state institutions in aggravating
Ma'am,
civil...
I'll just take just a minute on this, if you don't mind. Our military officer cadre is from middle and low middle class. They are not from HSN colleges and all those things. They are mostly from the people. So and in fact, they are from every portion of Pakistan. So there is that social acceptability, liking and love for the military. Yes, for doings of the military leadership, there is that fluctuation, and I end it here. Now coming to the second question was, your latest question was regarding the
role of other state institutions.
State institutions, yes.
In aggravating.
That is a very good question, and I would like to answer this. Now, let's see the latest happening, the no confidence motion against the government of Imran Khan. Now, everything is lumped against the army. But why the Supreme Court was opened late at night and the High Court, and why prison vans were there? So it was a collective kind of an effort. And if the military was in the lead role, then what was the Supreme Court doing? The apex court? So they therefore have a heart. What I mean is that what is the judiciary, the bureaucracy doing? I'll tell you what is the condition on ground. Our bureaucracy is totally politicized. And in the promotion conferences, it is said, oh, this fellow, is he on their side, on our side? And immediately after the change of government, there is shuffle of bureaucracy. It can't function. The country is not run in this manner. And then secondly, about the judiciary, I talked about the lower courts. Now, isn't it something appalling that people are commenting, the politicians, the leaders are commenting on the constitutions of the benches? This is mockery of justice. And then you blame me if I represent the army, that I'm responsible for everything. So it is I again refer to that, it is a collective failure. It is all the state institutions have to improve structurally, professionally, and morally.
Michael?
So I think that looking at the judiciary specifically, of course, there's going to be a Chief Justice, there's going to be a Supreme Court Justice here later today, and hopefully this question will be directed to her. But I think that if you just look at the data points, constitutionally, as I understand it, courts can't challenge decisions that are made by the military. A number of what one could describe as judicial coups against civilian prime ministers during PPP and PMLN rule in recent decades, and the very fact that, as you noted yourself earlier on, the fact that the Supreme Court has introduced this idea of the doctrine of necessity in Pakistan. Well, I think this all shows something that's concerning. But you could go in the other direction too. I mean, going back to the lawyers movement against Musharraf some years ago, I recall the Chief Justice became an activist in that, and he was involved in the protests against Musharraf. So that's sort of the opposite extreme, and I think that may highlight just how the judiciary in Pakistan at different times in its history has not been as apolitical as one might expect it to be. Again, Pakistan is a different context, but I think that the issue of it not being as apolitical as one would hope and expect, that really stands out.
Thank you, Michael. There'll be plenty to chew on that issue of a collective failure. But I want to step back a little now and look at how Pakistan's geopolitical positioning has perpetuated the asymmetry, if one can call it that, in civil-military relations. And I was wondering really to what extent my panelists believe that the military's control, if not prerogative, over the making of Pakistan's regional policies and the setting of strategic agendas has contributed to the imbalance in civil-military relations. I mean, there is, for example, a widely held view that the military's monopoly in determining Pakistan's relations with India, often in opposition to Pakistan's civilian leadership, has damaged the chances of any meaningful bilateral rapprochement. Afghanistan, of course, is another case in point, where the military's exclusive pursuit of a policy of so-called strategic depth, however discredited it may now be, has come back to haunt Pakistan in the form of a resurgent TTP that now enjoys sanctuaries offered by the Afghan Taliban across the border. And most recently, we've also witnessed a fallout between former Prime Minister Imran Khan and the military establishment over Pakistan's stance on the war in Ukraine and its implications for Pakistan's relations with the United States. So really, I think what I want to put to my panelists is whether you think that one way forward towards ensuring a healthier civil-military balance would be to ensure that these areas pertaining to Pakistan's regional policies and international relations, which have been the preserve of the military, should now fall, as in other democracies, squarely within the remit of Pakistan's elected governments. General Aslam?
Yeah.
Do you want to pick that up?
So ideally, it should be like that. I do not deny.
Ideally,
it should be like this. That the civilian should be, the elected government should be in the lead role, but then you have to see the historical perspective also. When the military is ruling, so they have to, run the government, and foreign policy is also included in that. So half of the portion is gone in that. So look how the things work. And since I'm privy to this, I've been through, during the service, I've experienced this thing, seen this thing, that the policy is by the head of the state or head of the government. If the president, General Pervez Musharraf was president, so he used to do it, General Zia used to do it. So, but we have very good institution. One is the Foreign Service of Pakistan. They are competent people doing a wonderful service, and they evaluate. Then there is input from the military as well, and the input is from a dedicated section which gives their own perspective, and then it is a collective kind of in collective wisdom they take decisions. So this is how the things work. Afghanistan has been little different. Why? Because right from the times of General Ziaulak, that military had more of interference or more to give because they had more stakes, perhaps. So Afghanistan was slightly different. Now, as far as this difference that General Baja gave a different statement and Imran Khan gave a different statement, it should not have happened. The Chief of Army Staff should not have given a separate statement. And they made fun of themselves that, head of the government or head of the government is talking something at tangent, and the Chief of Army is reading a paper which absolutely, and here comes the external intervention we'll talk about. So therefore, the question was then that who should, take the decisions as regards the foreign policy, the strategic direction, and the decisions which impact on our foreign policy. It has to be government with input. Pentagon gives input to the State Department, and then they decide that what USA policies have to unroll. So I agree on there is no difference of opinion on that, and if it is not happening, it is wrong. It should not happen that way.
Michael?
Did you want me to say a bit about the U.S. Issue here, how the U.S. engages with the civil-military relationship?
Well, I'll
Okay,
come to that.
Sure.
Just on this particular point about
regional, right.
About. I mean, you may or may not want to respond to it. You can just leave it and come in later on about whether or not the fact that the military has in Pakistan tended to arrogate to itself the position of the chief arbiter of Pakistan's regional and foreign policies, whether that has in some sense skewed the balance of civil-military relations. I said it's up to you whether you want to step in there.
Right. No, absolutely, it has skewed the balance. I think that's quite clear, and has been the case for some time. That I would argue that it's had deleterious results for Pakistan's interest, particularly in terms of diplomatic interest, in the sense that there's pretty strong public sentiment in both India and Afghanistan that Pakistan's military has been behind policies that have been very damaging and even deadly for both of those countries in terms of sponsoring militant groups that carry out attacks in India and Afghanistan. And that has certainly been a factor that I think has impeded better relations between Pakistan and India and Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's only one of a number of factors. And then also getting it to outcomes. I mean, if you look at how things have played out in geopolitically in the region, if you look at Kashmir, for example, I think it's quite clear that the way things are playing out now in Kashmir is not the way that Pakistan's military, which has played such a major role in policy vis-a-vis Kashmir, it hasn't played out in the way that the military would prefer. And then if you look at Afghanistan, I think you had already mentioned this, that clearly this bet on the Afghan Taliban to be Pakistan's best chance of a good partner there, that hasn't worked out for reasons that are clear to all.
Yes, and of course this has had economic implications for Pakistan.
Yes.
Because as long as you keep conflicts alive, the military can justifiably lay claim to the lion's share of the national exchequer. And I'm going to leave that question, for later to get the view of the audience. But I really think we should all be thinking, given Pakistan's severe economic crisis, whether the costs imposed by the military on Pakistan's national exchequer can be sustained any longer. Or must we really think that meaningful reform ought to be shared more equitably between the taxpayer, the Pakistani taxpayer, and a historically privileged military? But again, now I want to move to and remain in the area of external factors and look at or consider the conduct of foreign powers in distorting the relationship between civil and military authorities in Pakistan. The United States, of course, in particular, has long been seen to harbor a preference for working with Pakistan's military rather than its civilian leadership. even during brief interludes of elected government. And while there have been some efforts made, particularly, but again, notably by the United States to address this issue, and I'm thinking here of the Kerry-Lugar initiative or the Enhanced Partnership with Pakistan Act passed by US Congress in 2009, despite that, it appears to have done little to shift the impression that foreign powers, including some of Pakistan's major allies, China, for example, by prioritizing a security relationship with Pakistan, have aggravated the imbalance in civil-military relations. So really, the question is, I mean, to what extent do you think that the conduct of foreign powers has contributed, however inadvertently it may be, to sealing the preeminence of the military over elected governments in Pakistan? And what can they do to change this dynamic? I think this question has to go to you first, Michael.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so the perception that foreign powers empower the military by privileging relations with military leaders over civilian leaders is absolutely accurate to the present day, and certainly in a U.S. context. And I could briefly speak to that. You know, there's a joke that no one in Washington knows the name of the Pakistani defense minister at any time, just because there's always a preference to go through the army chief and not even talk to the defense minister. So this is unfortunate, but I think that there's a conundrum here for the U.S. and probably other foreign powers as well, because certainly for a country like the U.S., which genuinely supports civilian democracy in Pakistan, it obviously undermines that very goal by privileging relations with military leaders. But it also serves U.S. interest in a big way, just as it serves Chinese interest and British interest to engage with the army chief and to go to them, because get things done that way. I mean, that's the perception that, given that the army chief typically is the most powerful player in policy, if something needs to get done, you go to the army chief. And that's a perception that's unfortunately continued to the present day. But I will say this, again, in the U.S. context, given that we're seeing an evolution in the U.S. relationship with Pakistan since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, relations with Pakistan are going to be much less security and defense focused. Yes, I mean, the counterterrorism issue will sort of linger, but what you're starting to see is a desire on the part of the U.S. government, and particularly the State Department, to try to scope out some new areas of cooperation. And they're all in the non-security spaces, climate change, trade and investment, energy, education, things like that. So that suggests that perhaps there'd be opportunities to have less of an incentive to engage with military leaders. And indeed, the army chief is typically so present in so many different policy areas in Pakistan, but I'd like to hope that something like, education exchanges and climate change wouldn't be as present there. So that could bode well for the likes of Washington to engage more with civilian leaders. The final point on this, it is important to give the U.S. some credit, and I don't work for the U.S. government or anything like that, but indeed, you mentioned KLB. There have been efforts on the part of the U.S. to strengthen civilian institutions, and very quietly, USAID and some other U.S. agencies have continued to provide support to a number of initiatives in Pakistan that meant to strengthen education, energy security, and that, I think, by definition, is meant to strengthen to bring more stability, more prosperity, and by extension to strengthen civilians and civilian institutions. But yeah, going straight to the army chief unfortunately undermines those other actions.
And just before I pass on to General Aslam, I should say that, we've been talking about the compromises of the political classes and the way in which this is a collective failure, because, I mean, one reason why foreign powers perhaps are led to talk to the army chief rather than the elected prime minister and parliament is because for the most part, more often than not, our elected prime ministers have had little time for parliament. And so, the tendency for foreign powers to deal with the army chief can, I suppose, be readily explained in those terms as well. General Aslam?
Yeah, about the U.S. and foreign intervention, I would just like to, clarify one thing, that why do we focus on U.S. and other foreign powers? They have their own axe to grind. U.S. officials, U.S. government with reference to Pakistan will work for their national interest. It is upon us to work for our national interest. They don't care whether they go to the Prime Minister or to the Army Chief. They have their own agenda to fulfill. And in my considered opinion, let me shock you, that I believe that USA has permeated into every organization of Pakistan. And they have developed a mechanism to interfere into the decision-making loop of Pakistan. So this is the terms of this is what it is in the terms of penetration. This is what I believe. And yes, they would now, they do not make the army chief important by going to him. They feel that army chief is important, therefore they go to him. Therefore, it is upon us to put our house in order. Now, let me give you an example. I'll quote Mr. Shamshad Saab. He was the foreign secretary, and they had a meeting with the vice president of USA, who said that please don't bring the foreign secretary with you. And Mr. Nawaz Sharif and Shahbaz Sharif, quoting Shamshad Saab, foreign secretary, they talked to them and said, okay, we are going to sign the CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And the vice president said, okay, we have talked to your prime minister and his brother, and it is finalized. And Mr. Shamshad Saab I said, no, it is not recorded. I'm supposed to record the minutes. Therefore, what the moral of the story, what I want to bring is, Americans don't care whether they go to the army chief or anybody else. They have their own axe to grind, and they have their own agenda. We have to take care of our national interest.
Thank you. Well, now we're getting towards the end of our session here, the moderated session, but there are just two other questions of a general nature which I'm going to put to my panelists before we open up the floor. The first really is one of moving away from the conduct of what one might call everyday politics to the reach of a much harder to identify so-called security narrative that many now believe shapes the contours of the civil-military imbalance in Pakistan. Now, the reference here is to a narrative informed by what has come to be known as the enduring existential threat posed to Pakistan by India. And I wonder if the central place given to this threat in Pakistan's national discourse, pretty much since the creation of the state in 1947, means that the lasting dominance of the military is written into the DNA of the state. Very briefly, General Aslam, would you like to comment on that before I just move to Michael? And then
thank
you
for this question, a very important question. Just referring to the question, you made a remark earlier, Dr. Saiba, that was about that the military is the one which is interested in keeping the conflict alive. Well, I don't subscribe to this idea, because military is there because it is needed, and not that since they want to have fatter defense budget, they create a conflict and then get the money. This is, I think, not the correct analysis, and I would strongly object to this. Now, I referred earlier that the existential threat, yes, it is an existential threat. Why? We are a Muslim country. We have power potential. We have very dynamic people, engineers, doctors, and then we have the geography. We are a nuclear power. Had we been a Christian state, the dynamics of Pakistan would have been different. Had we been a Jewish state, Pakistan would have been a different kind of a power and state. So therefore, there are certain geopolitical realities of this world which emanate threat against Pakistan. So it is not the military which says, okay, we have to create a conflict because we want to have tanks and guns, and we have to have umpteen formations or the cadres in the army. This is wrong. Did we invite Soviet Union? Did Pakistan Army invite Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan? Did we invite USA? Michael? That Osama bin, that after 9/11 you invade Afghanistan? So therefore, please, again, I use that word, don't lump it on the army because army is creating conflict. It is our geopolitical positioning. That's how the ground reality is. Yes, I told you earlier, just see when you reflect, see the map of Pakistan and what is happening around Pakistan. Yes, if we were in one corner of Indian Ocean, not bothering anyone, we would have also been hunky-dory, a very happy state.
So I suppose, we are to take away from this that, Pakistan, as General Aslam was saying earlier on, is to be defined fundamentally as a security state, informed by a security narrative, and that the military is a realistic byproduct of those narratives and of that kind of state. Michael.
That's funny. I've heard at different times Pakistani leaders referring to their country as a prisoner of geography and also a beneficiary of geography. So I'm not sure which is right, or maybe both are right. No, very briefly. Right. Very briefly to this issue of the existential threat. This is a critical point that I'm glad you brought it up. My sense is that the military has used this notion of an existential threat posed by India as justification for the big role that it plays in politics, even if that's not just in politics, but in the state. And maybe that's not expressed explicitly, but I think it claims its legitimacy to that notion of an existential threat. But I would argue that this idea of an existential threat emanating from India, and I know I'm being provocative perhaps, is not accurate, quite frankly. And I know it's controversial to say that given what we see in India with the current government there and the things it's said, but let me be very clear. India's main concern right now is its northern border with China and the fact that it cannot deter China. It can't. I mean, that's very clear. And so India's strategic focus is on India. Is on China. It is not on harboring designs on Pakistan or anything like that. And one reason why India was willing to sign that LOC truce with Pakistan several years ago was to put itself in a position where it could focus even more attention on the China threat. So, and this is a very delicate issue, I know, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not 1971 anymore. It's not 1990 something. It's 2022, where for India and many other countries, it's this China issue that looms largest, and that's going to be the focus of Indian strategic thought and statecraft for the foreseeable future. And final point on this, you hear a lot of nasty things, a lot of nasty rhetoric, anti-Pakistan rhetoric from senior Indian officials, and I would argue a lot of that is for performative reasons. Political, it plays well. We know this. Talking tough on Pakistan, saying nasty things about Pakistan plays well politically, particularly as seen by the current government and the media outlets, the TV outlets in India, and many of them are aligned with India. They get the same benefit from it.
Thank you, Michael. And one last general question, which I hope the two of you will respond to very briefly, and that really is, coming back, I suppose, to the present. What I want to ask of you is, what do you think, given what we've been talking about, what do you think might be the shape? What would civilian supremacy in Pakistan look like against the background of current claims, and these claims are pretty widespread, that the democratic process in Pakistan is all but dead? Very, very briefly, General Aslam, followed by Michael, and then I want to really open it up to the floor.
Well, I'm an optimist, and I believe that it is not dead. That is I strongly object to this, that democratic process in Pakistan is dead. No, we have a hope, and what we should go for.
But hope is not a policy.
Hope will make a policy. If we do not dream, we can't realize. Therefore, you have to dream. Now, Pakistan, we have to go by the will of the people. And the answer is free and fair elections in Pakistan. Let there be a government. Now, I was surprised to listen when it was said that, perhaps Michael said this thing, that if you have free and fair elections and Imran Khan becomes with thumping majority, there'll be instability in the country. Then what is democracy?
That's what I said.
That
is the view of some.
Then what is the democracy if you are not going to follow the will of the people? Today Imran Khan is popular, tomorrow he may not be. So therefore, free and fair election, elected government, and let there be rule of law, rule according to the democratic norms of the world.
Thank you. So hope still lives eternal. Michael?
Yeah, I would agree that a free and fair election is essential, especially given constitutionally one is supposed to occur by the end of the year. I think the best one could hope for in terms of this idea of civilian supremacy, given how things are with civil-military relations, is that things revert to the status quo ante, to how they were maybe pre-2018, when the army was only meddling in the areas that it traditionally meddles in, defense and foreign policy and so on. We've seen the army become so much more involved in so many other spheres, including the economy, which has happened at times in the past, but not as much. So I think that's the best that we could hope for. Just focus. Ideally, it would get out of all of these areas, including foreign policy and defense. That's not realistic. So I think the best we can hope for is that it would distance itself from these non-security, non-defense spheres and let the civilians take control there.
Thank you. Well, it's just come up to 1:10, and I wonder if the organizers will let me have until 1:30. Is that possible? Okay, right. What I'm going to do, I've seen lots of hands go up. Gender balance, so there's going to be a woman and a man, and from both ends of the room, and then front and forward. So, the lady, please, by the way, keep your questions short. I want as many people as possible here to be able to ask questions. So no speeches, we've had all that. Questions, please. The lady here. Could you also please identify yourself?
Thank you so much. My name is, am I audible?
If you have a loud voice, just
Yeah.
raise it.
Okay, thank
Go
you
on.
so much. My name is
If you stand up, stand up.
Sorry.
Thank you.
My name is Haneen Fareed, and I had a question about the Kashmir conflict. So I'm actually from Indian-occupied Kashmir, and I've seen firsthand that the effect that the Indo-Pak conflict can have on us, where at a state today where the abrogation of Article 370 has caused an immense negative impact on the human population in Kashmir. So given the sensitivities in the region today, would you say that it is better to have a more active military approach in Kashmir, given the human cost, or would you be in favor of a more diplomatic approach to the conflict in today's time? Thank you.
Okay. It has some bearing, but it's sort of tangential to the question of civil-military imbalance inside Pakistan. Kashmir is a topic in and of itself. I will keep that in mind, but if I could just have one more question from this end. Is there a woman on this? Okay, the woman at the back there. And then perhaps the two of you. So we'll take pairs of questions.
Thank you. My name is Atika Rahman. I'm Dawn's UK correspondent. I'm going to be very quick. General Bajwa made an unprecedented statement about the military's meddling in politics shortly before he bowed out as chief. But what is the long-term value, and this is for General Aslam, what is the long-term value of this statement? Are incoming army chiefs bound to follow his declaration? Just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, Atika. If a chief of army staff is giving this statement, in his welfare and farewell address, then I don't attach any credence to that. Because, yes, I don't care, because it is immaterial. The guy is going. He played his innings for on extension.
Okay.
That too on extension. So that's what I mean. That is true. But having said that, hopefully the meddling armies, meddling into political affairs is going to recede. And noted this day and time, it will recede, and soon.
So we can all look forward to a neutral military. But Michael, do you want to just pick up on the question of Kashmir, whether a more robust military approach to Kashmir might pay dividends, and whether actually it might be damaging to the kind of balance that we are all trying to establish inside Pakistan?
Right. Yeah. So thank you for your question. I don't see how a more robust military role could lead to the types of outcomes that would be beneficial for Kashmiris. I would think that you really have to look for the diplomatic route and the dialogue. But of course, that's frozen in time and has been for quite some time. But even that is unlikely. The Indian government, as you know, believes that there's nothing to discuss anymore in that context. But I don't see how a stepped-up military role would make sense unless you're suggesting the idea of the military leading dialogue, which of course there is precedent for that with the Musharraf formula and all of that, which never quite succeeded, but there was some progress there. But given the way in which, broadly speaking, India and the Indian political elite, the strategic elite, perceive Pakistan's military, don't see it as a trustworthy partner. I think that ideally you'd want to look at this from a more diplomatic context. But to be very honest, I just don't expect any forward movement at all on that front because of these realities, particularly the way that India feels about the dispute.
Right. Now, I want two guys, one from the front and one from the back. So, perhaps the gentleman here, if you could identify yourself, please.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm a PhD candidate in economics. My question is generally for the panel. I'll try being brief as I can. It seems Pakistan has really struggled with its identity, and I feel like in its history it's been struggling with its identity in a number of ways, and I think it's reflected in this discussion today. I mean, we started with Assalamu alaikum, but many of the panel have been discussing democracy and nationalism, which seem to contradict the very foundation of what Pakistan starts with. We banned nationalist symbols, but we asked everyone to recite the national anthem.
But what's the question?
My question is simple. Isn't it time that we step aside for all of these Eurocentric models of democracy and democratic regimes that have clearly failed time and time again, and start delivering to the people a political system that seems, by many measures, by many standards, that aligns with their political disposition? And that seems a very Islamic sentiment. As we mentioned here, it's a Muslim majority country. Should we not siphon out these failed political systems and re-establish something more in line and sync with their sentiments, which I believe is Islam?
Thank you. A gentleman from the back, please. Here, this one. Please keep your questions short.
My name is Talha Khalid. My question to journalism primarily. So you mentioned it's not possible to switch off the army, but my question is, why is it not possible to bring reforms within the GHQ to decentralize the power of the army chief? Because I come from a military background. My father's retiring as a 2-star general as well. I feel that the Joint Chief, the Naval Chief, or the Air Chief do not have any say or do not call the shots. And if we decentralize the powers of the army chief, we might be able to, just avoid a lot of this confusion that, the foreign officers reaching out to the army chief or the US reaching out to the army chief. So if we decentralize the powers, because at this stage, we don't see any role of the Joint Chief, we might be able to, decentralize by giving promotions at least to the Joint Chief or troops under Army Chief. So there should be some sort of balance to avoid this, because we've seen this failing in the past. So yeah.
Thank you. Just to summarize, so the first question relates to whether or not Pakistan should jettison what is being described or or as Eurocentric models. What the alternative might be is really anyone's guess, but we will want to think about that. And General Aslam, I suppose that question really was directed to you about reforms in the GHQ, and whether or not, in fact, flowing from that, the army chief, is I mean, the whole structure is top heavy, giving the army chief the kind of preeminence that is denied to other service chiefs. But Michael, do you want to just pick up on the Eurocentric bit, and then I think General Aslam, please.
Yeah, very briefly, it's a fair question. I think it's a very important one. I think that at such a partisan moment, I think the question there would be, how do you start that kind of conversation, and who should be leading that type of conversation? Who should the stakeholders be? I think it's a very important conversation to have, but the current moment would seem to be the wrong moment to have it. I think it's an important point. To be quite honest, not to put her on the spot, the best person to answer that question is Dr. Shaikh, because she's written the seminal book on Pakistan's identity challenges, Making Sense of Pakistan. But she'd be better placed than I to respond. But great point, but I think the question is how to go about that and when is the right moment.
Thank you, but I'm not going to hog time.
Right.
We can have a private discussion, but General Aslam, please.
Right. The fundamental point in when you have a military setup is the unity of command. Internally, for the running of the army, the command should be totally with the army chief. And when you talk about diluting his powers, those are in relation to intervention into the political affairs. So therefore, I don't think any restructuring is needed within the GHQ. GHQ is designed to control and command the military formation under its purview. The other point is that, yes, the Chairman, Joint Chief of Staff, there have been a number of studies that office should be empowered, but still the deployment, employment, training, recruitment, everything within the army, there has to be a unity of command, and it's like in India and in USA and all other professional armies. But the Chairman's office needs to be strengthened.
Thank you. The gentleman there at the back, and I'll take one from a woman in the front. Are there any? Perhaps you. Okay, so shall we take your question first? Please make it brief, and then the lady in front.
Taimur Iqbal. In the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned about the confluence of events. So a country on the verge of economic, social, political, and climate catastrophe. What are the fundamental set of reforms which are needed? The way forward? What's the paradigm shift that we need? And more importantly, are the current stakeholders capable of indulging in those reforms, or do we need an entirely new set of stakeholders? And this is a question for all the panelists. And Jan Saf, a particular question for you. You said you voted for Imran Khan and you would vote for Imran Khan in future. May I ask why?
That since I was, I thought you will understand because everybody else has understood. The point is, since I was going to criticize him, therefore I gave it as a preamble. And I am not going to show my ballot paper to you.
Though it's best to bear in mind that, we still like to harbor the idea of a secret ballot. So that was a very forward question. The lady in front here.
Hi, good afternoon. I was just interested in the collective responsibility argument that we had, or discussion that we had. In my view, it's more the politicians that are responsible for the state we are in currently. It's a bygone conclusion that the military should not be involved in all of this. However, when we were talking about the judiciary, ma'am, and when Justice Kosas sent back the extension application for General Bajwa, a government whose leader, in the name of the party, has justice, bent over backwards to get that extension approved. That is at a time when you had a very good Chief Justice in the Supreme Court. But that was not adhered to. The whole constitution was changed. This law of imprisoning people who speak against the institutions was introduced again by a party that has justice in its name. You were speaking about ambassadors, sir. I am a daughter of a former ambassador. The politicians send ambassadors to the US and UK.
What's the question?
The question is not a joint responsibility. It's a responsibility of people who come into power and they think that the end justifies the means, not the means justify the end.
So regardless of whether or not they are military or civilian?
Yes, then how is it collective responsibility? That's my question. I think it's the responsibility of the...
I can respond to this.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay. General Aslam,
Yeah,
if you want to.
you see, when we say collective responsibility, that means that if military within its domain has done a wrong thing, it's wrong. But obviously, I talked about the foreign service, I talked about the judiciary, I talked about the lower courts and all. The governance is the basic problem, and damning corruption is the problem. So do not attribute everything to the military. So every component of those people who are in power, the institution and persons, they are to be held responsible. So therefore I say that we have failed as a state and as a society.
Thank you. And now that question about the paradigm shift. I mean, do we have in Pakistan the wherewithal, Michael, to introduce the kind of paradigm shift that will enable Pakistan to address some of these multiple crises that it's confronted with? What is needed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would require a completely new brand of leadership, which doesn't exist now and has not for quite some time. You know, a brand of leadership that would be willing to place the public interest above, you know, personal, political,
You're
provincial
talking about
needs.
a new generation or a new brand?
Both,
leadership?
but I think that one could traditionally look to a newer generation that would be most likely to embrace something very new. You know, a generation, a form of leadership that will be willing to take on the vested interests, to engage in these economic reforms that are so politically risky to do. All of this has been resisted, and I think that that's what's most needed. But it's sort of a chicken and egg issue. I mean, one could argue that there need to be conditions on the ground that are in place before you could have a very different type of newer, younger leadership come into play. But I think the simple answer to your question, right now, at this moment, I don't think it's realistic to think that a paradigm shift can be in place. We'd have to look to the next generation, I would think.
Right.
Can
Okay.
Can I add to this?
Yes, of course.
A short comment on this. Actually, I believe that there has to be an evolutionary approach. You cannot have a revolutionary approach. There are silver linings. There are wonderful people in every department, in every institution. So you see, I'm coming from Pakistan. I live there. You just switch off the news channels and go around, hunky-dory, everything is good. So therefore, please don't, when we say that we are failing in number of things, we have problems, we have economic dilution, everything, but don't forget that we are not a gone case. We can recover. We are a very resilient nation, and we will bounce back, inshallah.
Yes, well, new generation, new leadership. You know, our dynastic parties are churning them out. You know, we have Bilawal Bhutto, we have Maryam Nawaz, we have Munis Elahi. I mean, they are the next generation and next brand of leadership.
Thank you.
The lady here, just a minute.
Sorry, can you hear me? My question is for General Saab. It was refreshing to hear you say that you believe that the army should step back. I think that's something that we haven't heard, and we were quite impatient to hear this. As an organizer of the conference, when we announced the panel, there was a lot of backlash that we received with people wanting a civilian to present a civilian perspective. Why do you think, after so many years, people still believe that a retired general can't speak on behalf of the common Pakistanis? Where do you think that sort of rift between the civilians and the army?
No, that idea is, I do not believe in this civil-military divide. For the reference sake, it's all right that this is civilian military. This has been overplayed and rather a part of the propaganda which perpetually goes on. My father is a civilian. My son is a civilian. My brother is a civilian. My friends are civilian. There is no such divide. Please try to understand. If somebody on the top leadership had done something wrong, then it can't be, I said earlier, it can't be attributed to the entire army. We are from the middle and lower middle class people. we are part of this society, and all the ills what are and good things or bad things in the society, you cannot insulate an institution from the outside influences. If you have corruption, there will be corruption in military. If you have disorder, it will in some form come into. So therefore, army is a great institution, and it is your institution. It is symbol of security and stability in the country. Yes, we have to mend our ways, and that we would.
Right, but it does have some kind of institutional integrity which distinguishes it as the state institution that it is. I mean, it is, of course, as you say, a part of that society. Nevertheless, it operates as an institution with corporate interests of its own. There is a long period of tutelage to which military officers are subjected, which in some sense affect their transformation. But we'll...
No,
we'll,
but
we'll
madam, please, I have to clarify this point. Are you talking about the millibus and all? Military businesses?
No, not at all, not at all. I'm just talking about the kind of institutional identity that the military develops. After all, you have hundreds going in to attend these, military academies and schools. I mean, they are being molded. They are being molded to provide for a coherent and well integrated institution that okay, we've seen that exposed, but which is expected to operate over and above the fray of society and politics. I mean, that remains the dominant ethos.
Because by training and by checks, military is a very disciplined force. I'm just giving you example that look, the first appointment was a company commander, 100 people armed to teeth with weapons. You have to control these people. So therefore we are groomed. Therefore we are more disciplined. We are more. But what I meant was that you find streaks of news of about the negative things. The society has an influence on the military also. You have a point, ma'am. I take it.
Thank you. Well, I would love to continue, but I've just had a tap on my shoulder to say that we've run out of time. So I am really sorry for those of you who wanted to put questions. Perhaps you can chase our panelists later. But my role now is over, and it really only remains for me to thank all of you for being here. And I'm now going to call on Myra Ahmed, the outreach officer, to give us our marching orders. Where are you, Myra?
Thank you, Dr. Shaikh, and thank you all very much for your questions. This brings us to the conclusion of our first session titled Civil-Military Relations, Coexistence or Confrontation. Today's panel shed light upon what is arguably the most defining feature of Pakistan's political landscape, reflecting on both the prospects of a functional relationship between the civilians and the military and the risks that come with deepening antagonism between the two parties. Interestingly, both our panelists agreed that the intervention of the military within the political landscape should be minimized, but presented contrasting visions for the future of this kind. Dr. Shaikh raised important questions about Pakistan's persistent employment of a security narrative, the capacity for neutrality in civil-military relations, and most importantly, whether or not civil supremacy in Pakistan truly exists or not. Ultimately, it becomes clear that both Pakistan's past and present have been shaped by the volatile relationship between these two institutions. The future of Pakistan, in this case, is thus heavily dependent on all institutions and stakeholders operating within their constitutional boundaries. Our thanks today go to Mr. Michael Kugelman, General Haroon Aslam, and Dr. Farzana Shaikh for their invaluable contributions, and we hope that today's discussion serves as stimulus for future conversation and discourse. We will now take a brief break for refreshments, which will be served outside the old theatre. There's also a food cart stationed outside of the old building, serving halal food should anyone wish to have lunch. Following this, we will have our second panel of the day, titled Pakistan's Economy, Sustainable Growth and Sovereign Debt from 2 p.m. onwards, Please note that if you are joining us for the second session, food and drink will not be allowed inside the theatre, and please also ensure that you are wearing the relevant wristband for that session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Very kind of you, very kind.
It was great, and I'm glad we kept to time.
Yes.
Two of you were just brilliant,
well
and I think
moderated,
there was a
and
It's a great pace.